Okay, excellent. Yes, so gardening for butterflies, moths, and bees. I forgot to forgot to include moths in my title, but they're a very important part of our garden biodiversity. And just in case you haven't heard of us before, Butterfly Conservation is a charity which was founded in 1968 with a mission to conserve butterflies, moths, and our environment. And we do that in a number of ways. We undertake practical conservation work to save these insects. We promote the scientific study of butterflies and moths. We safeguard the important sites through our nature reserves. And a large part of my job is around the public enjoyment of butterflies and moths. And just to introduce them then, they belong to a group called Lepidoptera, which means scaly wings, as you can see in the photograph here of a peacock butterfly. All those little scales are on the wings and they make up the patterns of the butterfly or moth. There's around 180,000 species worldwide, and 59 butterfly species are resident or migrants to the UK, and we have 2,500 species of moths. And just to introduce you to one of the most common species, and one which should be flying soon, it's the orange tip. They usually come out in May and June, and they get together and they mate around those months. And they lay their eggs mostly on cuckoo flower or garlic mustard, two common wildflowers. As you can see, it's really easy to look for the eggs because they're bright orange and they're laid upon the seed pod or the flower stalk of the plants. So you can actually survey for these butterflies in that way. The caterpillars then hatch out and they feed for about a month or so, a month to 6 weeks or so on the seed pod mostly. And then they form a chrysalis, so they'll crawl off somewhere into a shrub or onto a fence post or some hard surface, make a chrysalis, and they'll remain inside that throughout the entire winter, only come out the following year. So actually most of their life is spent as a chrysalis. But you'll also find hibernating adults. Some of you might have seen these already this year. You might see some butterflies which have spent the winter inside cold sheds or even in cold rooms in your home. They spend the winter as adults, and that includes the peacock butterfly and the small tortoiseshell, two of our most widespread species. They emerge early in spring when the temperatures rise, and they will mate now, and then they will lay their eggs mostly on stinging nettles, and there'll be a later generation coming out in the autumn, late summer and into autumn. We also got migratory species, things like the painted ladies. Painted ladies have their main breeding ground in sub-Saharan Africa, but they begin to, as the year progresses, they begin to fly north. That's for the adults to find more caterpillar food plants for their future offspring, but also to avoid parasitic wasps, which can lay their eggs inside the caterpillars. So over 6 generations, they make an epic round trip, going from Africa even to the Arctic Circle, and then back again, which is a 9,000-mile round trip, which they do over 6 generations. And in 2019, we had a huge influx of them. Millions of them arrived in Scotland, possibly coming from Scandinavia, flying across the North Sea. So it depends on the weather in Europe every year on the number of painted ladies that we get. But our butterflies are in trouble, and the State of UK Butterflies 2015 report found that 3/4 of butterfly species in the UK had declined in their range or their abundance over the past 40 years. When we look at the reasons for this, much of it is because of agricultural intensification. If you look at the countryside now, much of it is just what I call the green desert. There's a lot of greenery from crops growing, but often there's few wildflowers for butterflies to lay their eggs upon. And it's the same situation for bees and moths and other animals. Then within our woodlands, they become very dark places. There's a lack of coppicing in many woodlands now. So they become really dark, and the butterflies which require woodlands also need these sunny rides and glades to exist within them. And that just isn't the case so much anymore. But other types of habitat loss have included 40% of our native broadleaf woodlands, 200,000 miles of hedgerow. We've lost 20 million elm trees because of Dutch elm, and now we're losing many of our ash trees as well because of ash dieback. We've lost 98% of our flower-rich meadows, and we're also looking at climate change and pesticides to see what effect those are having too. So it's been described as death by 1,000 cuts for insects because they're really getting it from many angles at the moment. So we can help them in our garden. So, and if you're interested in growing food for yourself, any fruits that you can grow in the garden, all of these flowers will turn into delicious fruits to eat, including even things like peas do need pollinated by bees, and courgettes and pumpkins and things like that. All of these things require pollination, and that's mostly by insects. And we're also helping things in the wider food web. Even if you're not interested in insects, if you're interested in birds or bats, you need the insects there to give them something to eat. And a quick question, if anyone can roughly think in their head how many grubs, and that's food items such as spiders or grubs or other things, it can take to raise one nest of blue tits with 10 chicks inside. Well, it's been estimated around 40,000. So they can actually feed about 1,000 items per day to those chicks. So really, they're doing a lot of work, but they need that food around them in the garden. It also gives us a closer connection with nature. And for me, it's a question of why wouldn't you? Gardens without wildlife in them, I think, are so boring. And I think it really adds so much when you can see wildlife in your garden. Gardens cover more than 1 million hectares of land in the UK, but a report from RHS called Greening Great Britain found that in urban areas, gardens can cover 50% of green space, which is fantastic. However, in 2005, only 7% of UK front gardens were completely paved, and in 2015, that was almost 30%. So we're losing a lot of actual green space, a lot of the biodiversity, and it's just being paved over. And now we also have the even worse problem of the kind of plastic grass that gets put down in gardens too. But making our gardens better for pollinators can really help their populations. And one of the easiest tips from me whenever you go to the garden centre is to avoid what I call the plastic plants. So the plastic plants to me might as well be made of plastic because they have no available pollen or nectar. And this includes most of the bedding plants which are on sale in garden centres at the moment. These plants have been bred and selected by horticulturalists over centuries to make really showy blooms that last for a very long time, but that has been at the expense of the food which the insects actually need. And this includes many of the common bedding plants, including what you call like the pansies and violas and such like, petunias, the tender geraniums. Hardy geraniums are perfect for insects, but the tender ones are no good at all. And then polyanthus, which look just like primrose. But you can see the whole list there of plants to avoid. Luckily, though, that list is very short, and these are basically the only plants you need to avoid because almost everything else you can get out of garden centre is good for insects. So just avoid those few plastic ones and get everything else in the garden centre. But also it's really important when you're choosing your varieties. So if you look at the dahlia on the left-hand side, you can see that the insects have no chance of getting inside there, even though there will be food inside for them. Whereas the one on the right-hand side is an open variety, lots of food for these bumblebees, and you can see the stark difference there. You can also apply that to plants like roses and clematis and hollyhocks, anything which has double flowers or multiple flowers like this. So it's a really simple thing to do. But the good news then is just avoiding those few plastic plants and unsuitable flower shapes, and almost everything else is good for insects. This is a garden I visited in Fife last August, and it wasn't a wildlife garden, but it was full of wildlife because it had these herbaceous perennial plants, which were just covered in insects, including bumblebees and hoverflies and moths and butterflies. So it shows that you don't even really have to be trying to garden for insects to achieve something like this. So what I'll do now is just give a quick list of some of the plants which I find are good for insects and will grow even in the harsh weather of the Scottish Highlands. So you don't have to take this list down because I will send out a list through TWIC next week. So maybe it's just kind of taking a short list down. But early on in the year, it's really important because the queen bumblebees, when they come out of hibernation, are starving. They haven't had food since last October or November, and it's the same for butterflies. So really, they need plants which flower quite early in the year. And my top one is early flowering heather, just because it is such a long flowering plant. It's really reliable, and you can get these shrubs even in supermarkets now, and they're usually covered in insects early on. Then some of the types of bulbs include muscari, also known as grape hyacinth, but even the Christmas hyacinths that you might have got before, you can just stick those bulbs in the ground and they'll come up year after year, and insects will visit them early on in spring. Then some of our herbaceous plants, including lungwort and hellebore, but also some of our native wildflowers, don't forget them. So we have our native primroses or cowslips. Avoid the multicolored garden center polyanthus though, because they're no good for insects. But also bugle or ajuga, which is the plant on the lower photograph here. You can see it's got these purpley blue flowers, little spikes of them, but they're always covered in insects. Then progressing through the year, keeping with bulbs, you got some alliums. All the alliums are really good for insects, so get them. The hardy geraniums, I think every garden should have a hardy geranium because they can grow even in deep shade or in full sun, and even some of them can grow in very dry soil too. So there's different types of hardy geraniums, but they usually have purple or blue flowers like this. Then there's the perennial cornflower too. They're great for bees especially. But also you want to look for plants with big heads on them, and this includes many of the plants in the thistle family, or the daisy family, which is the one on the left-hand side here. It's one of the it's called Cirsium rivulari, which is a type of cultivated thistle, and you'll see insects just landing on the head, and they will just get in nectar and pollen from all the little florets there. Also, the scabieuses are good too because again they've got heads which are packed full of food for the insects. And there's other plants like catmint and Verbena venerensis. But then later in summer, it's really important that you keep planting right until the end of the year because insects will be out until October or November time. Some of the plants I'd recommend are sea hollies. You can get many different types of these, also known as eryngiums, and the dahlias with the open flowers. Again, they flower quite late in the year too. Echinaceas and heleniums, if you're doing some prairie planting, these are perfect. Eupatorium, the last butterflies I saw last year were on Eupatorium, which grows really quite tall, grows over 6 feet tall, but you can get smaller ones. And all the red admirals I saw in October and even into November were feasting on the Eupatorium. Then there's phlox, which is great because it has deep flowers for the insects to feed upon. Then Michaelmas daisies and cardoon are great ones too. And sedums as well. So there's a sedum called Autumn Joy, which flowers in August, September, and even into October. And as you can see from the photograph, it can just be covered in insects because it's one of those very late flowering ones. And the insects can get a good feast of nectar, which they store as fat inside their bodies before they go back into hibernation. If you've only got a smaller space, like many of us living in urban areas, you might only have room for a herb or a window box. That's no problem because you could be growing herbs for the kitchen as well as food for insects. So let's have a look at some of those. So you could be growing chives and rosemary, two really early flowering ones which flower in spring. Then later in summer, you have lavender and thyme. Then marjoram and strawberries. And lemon balm and mint. And all the types of mint that you can grow are really good for insects. If you just let them flower, this is what mint flowers often look like. They flower very late in summer. So again, they're really good for insects before they go into hibernation. And many of these plants, including some of the Mediterranean herbs, are very drought tolerant. So even if you've only got a small window box, hopefully they won't die. If you go away for a couple of weeks, you should come back and they should be still alive, hopefully. But if we want to really help populations of butterflies, we need to look at their caterpillar food plants. Many of our common species, such as small tortoiseshell, red admiral, peacock, and comma, lay their eggs on stinging nettles. Now, if you have a nettle patch in your garden, that's a very good start. But if you want to make it good for insects, for the butterflies, it really wants to be in full sun. And that's because those caterpillars will be heating their bodies up, and it helps them to digest their food. So butterflies usually select nettles in sunny positions to lay their eggs upon. But also plants in the cabbage family, and that could be actual cabbages. Sometimes I grow actual cabbages from seed every year and just stick them in the border. That will be good food for the white butterflies, including large white and small white. But you can also be growing things like nasturtium, sweet rocket, and honesty. And last year in my garden, I grew sweet rocket, and I had actually orange tips laying their eggs upon it. And this is an orange tip chrysalis I found on the sweet rocket in my garden. But also, if you have an area for wildflowers, you could be growing cuckoo flower and garlic mustard, especially for the orange tips and green faint whites. And this is just a photograph from a flat in Stirling. This is a first floor flat with a hanging basket with nasturtiums coming out. And if we just have a close look there, you can see an egg of a small white butterfly. So it's an urban area, and the butterfly must have just flown along, smelled the food, found it, and laid its egg upon it. So it shows that you can do a lot with even a small space. One of the best things you can do in a garden is to have a hedgerow. Fences are all right, but and they're better than walls, but hedgerows are even better because you can sustain populations with of so many different things, including insects, but also hedgehogs and little mammals too. So hedgerows with native trees and shrubs, again, if they have flowering plants in them, even better. So you can have hawthorn, dog rose, honeysuckle, many different things like this through the hedge, which will provide food for the adults, but also food for the caterpillars of these. And you'll find bumblebees will nest at the bottom of hedgerows too. And I'll just have a quick look at this page, basically to show that some of the best food plants for many different species of moth are our native trees and shrubs. And many of these do really well in small gardens, including different types of birch. You can get smaller types of birch. You can also get really small willows too, such as the Kilmarnock willow, which won't grow very big at all, and they will be food for dozens of species of moth caterpillars. And if you grow something like silver birch in your garden or an alder, you could be getting beautiful moths such as the canary shouldered thorn, which is a really nice moth to get in your garden. But it's really important that we maintain that shelter for them, because even when we can't see them, many species don't go underground. They actually remain on plants through the winter. So if we are getting rid of all the material, if we're chipping it and burning it, that's killing the next generation. And just to go back to the photograph of the orange tip chrysalis, this was from Sweet Rocket that I was clearing away at the end of summer, and I found this then. And if I had been a gardener who was clearing away absolutely everything and putting it in the compost heap or burning it, this chrysalis would have been killed by that process. So just to a reminder that things are still there even when we can't see them so clearly. So you can take a more relaxed approach to maintaining the garden, which is really good news, because then you can actually sit and enjoy the thing. So you can leave some sections or sides of hedges unpruned if you have a hedge. And just a reminder, don't chip or burn cuttings. What I tend to do in my garden is I have quiet areas where I just leave stuff. So when I'm clearing things away, I will just take the material and I'll stack it somewhere in like a quiet corner of the garden. So I'm not composting it. I'm just letting it remain there through the winter so that things like this can survive. And we can provide shelter and homes for bees too. We have over 270 species of bee in the UK, and most gardens will be attracting probably at least 6 species of bumblebee, including the common carder bee, which is our commonest, mostly ginger bee, and also the garden bumblebee, which is a species with a really long tongue. So if you want to help bumblebees, they make about football-sized nests in quiet places in your garden, so in hedges or in thick grass. Some of them even nest in compost heaps. So for your bumblebees, they're wanting somewhere quiet, out of the way. So a hedge would be perfect for them. But also you could dig a hole, about a football-sized hole just at the surface of the ground, and cover it with a slate. And oftentimes you'll find that bumblebees will nest in places like that. But most of our bee species are solitary bees, which use cavities or dig small holes in the ground. So here's Clark's mining bee, Andrena clarkella. It's a ground nesting bee. So for species like that, they need bare ground in sunny positions, especially if it's sandy. And you can get bees from the Andrenas nesting in positions like that. Bee hotels can work, but I think a lot of them are cons. You spend sometimes £20 on a bee hotel, and it's made out of plastic sometimes, which is really detrimental to them because the plastic holds water in it and it can cause the bees to die from fungal infections. Here's one that I made last year during lockdown #1. I just found some birch which had been cut down nearby. I drilled different sized holes into it, and as you can see, within a week there was a bee nesting in it. So you can see the mud here. That was brought by a red mason bee. And it's nesting inside there, and the larvae are still in there and should hopefully emerge soon. So you can actually make them really easily yourself, but the important thing is to just provide a wee shelter over it so that the rain runs off instead of it getting really wet. And if you can get some of those ones made out of canes, and you can attract leaf cutter bees to them. Here's one from my parents' garden. You can see the female bee bringing leaves to make the nest inside that. So those things do work, but if you have them, you want to put them in a sunny position. South facing is best because many of those solitary bees need that heat to develop, whereas the bumblebees want somewhere shady and out of the way. And as I mentioned, sandy banks and sunny positions can also really attract those ground nesting species. And just if you have a lawn, lawns are fine if you mow them every month or so though, so don't do them every 2 weeks. You'll be getting things like white clover, self-heal, and even dandelions, which are a fantastic source of food for bees early on in the year. And if you want to control what we call pests, some people call pests in the gardens, just don't be using chemicals. I'll not spend too long on this, but basically avoid chemicals and allow your garden to become an ecosystem where there can be predators which can attack aphids and other so-called pests for you. If you're buying compost, remember that a lot of compost has peat in it, and peat is extracted from the ground in many places in Ireland and in some places in Scotland still. Peatlands contain more carbon than the world's forests combined, but UK gardeners use 3 billion litres of peat every year. So ask your garden centre to stock peat-free compost and stop buying peat compost is our message on that. If you want a meadow, then this can help a wider range of species. The one on the left-hand side is a perennial native meadow that will be helping the caterpillar stage of many species, whereas the one on the right-hand side is a cornfield annual one, which will be mostly helping the adult stages. But just a long grass around the hedges and edges is a good start if you haven't got room for a full meadow. My first tip in that really would just be to grow wild, let it grow and see what comes up. You could be having many wildflowers in your lawn already, and then you can add to it with different species such as common sorrel for small coppers, and long grass is good for just the brown butterfly species, and birds-foot trefoil for common blue butterflies and burnet moths. Now, one of the things to take away from today is if you want to download an app, we have a free app called iRecord Butterflies, and you can actually use this to submit records of butterflies either on the go or whenever you get home. And it's also got a free guide in it. So go on your app store for Android or Apple and download the free iRecord Butterflies app, and that would be a great way to send in your sightings this year. And if you want, I am running some butterfly idea monitoring workshops this month. I'll ask the organisers of the conference today to send this out next week to everybody, but these are the dates where I'll be running my workshops all this month, so coming up next week and the week after. They're all online through Zoom, lasting 2 hours in the morning, and you can book through this website here. So I will ask that to be sent around next week, and I'll put it in the chat box too, so you can get it from the chat box here. So just to say thanks for listening. Hopefully that was something useful for you, and I'm happy to take any questions.